Next up, you only live twice. Remember that one? It's a good one. Is there any other life left in the Delta? Can it be restored and live again? This morning, Dr. Robin Grossinger will share years developing a model what the Delta looked like before levees, farming, water delivery, and invasive species took over. In addition, we have Delta expert Kurt Schmude back again to share with us not only a snapshot of the Delta today, but a glimpse into what the Delta could look like in the future, depending on what choices and investments we decide to make.
This dream is for you, so pay the price.
Do a little intro here.
One dream.
Dr. Robin Grossinger, of the senior scientist at San Francisco Estuary Institute, where he directs SFEI's Resilient Landscapes program. For over 20 years, Robin has analyzed how San Francisco Bay and other California landscapes have changed since European contact, using these data to highlight opportunities and guide landscape scale restoration strategies. The innovative work of Robin and his colleagues to synthesize history and science has been acclaimed for helping scientists, managers, and the public appreciate both the dramatic transformation and the impressive resilience of the state's ecosystems. Robin's many publications include the Napa Valley Historical Ecology Atlas, released by the University of California Press in 2012. He has been recognized with the Local Hero Award from the Bay Nature magazine in 2012, and the Carla Bard Bay Educational Award by the Bay Institute and Aquarium of the Bay in 2014. Kurt Schmude is a civil engineer and a manager specializing in water resources and environmental planning. He is currently a consultant for the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. Prior to his association with MWD, that began in 2006, he worked with the California Department of Water Resources for 21 years. Mr. Schmude has led multiple programs and projects involving the Sacramento, San Joaquin River Delta, and Suisun, I'm a surfer, I may not be able to pronounce everything right, marsh, including levee improvement programs, land subsidence research, economic risk analysis, dredged material reuse projects, water quality studies, and environmental restoration projects. Since joining the Metropolitan Water District effort, he has been managing large-scale ecosystem restoration projects, planning emergency drought actions to protect Delta water quality, implementing seismic flood risk mitigation strategies, planning actions to protect Delta smelt, and advancing new conceptual water conveyance alternatives to achieve a sustainable Delta for both water supplies and the ecosystem. He also served as a lead expert witness for DWR on the Jones Tract levee failure litigation. So please join me in welcoming Robin and Kurt. Thank you, gentlemen.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to be here this morning to talk a little bit about something I'm very excited about. I've been working in the Bay Delta system for what I like to say a quarter of a century, and as was stated, I've been working for the last almost decade on habitat restoration, and I'm very excited and honored today to be presenting with Robin Grossinger, who is one of the, if not the most preeminent scientist that is leading the effort to understand the ecology that used to exist that will really guide us as we move forward into the future to do our habitat restoration efforts. The Delta story we're going to tell here today is one that the Delta has changed radically. It's a highly altered state today. It's nothing like it used to be. I like to tell people, I don't know how many of you have been in the Delta, show of hands. The Delta that you see today is nothing like the Delta that used to exist. And we're very excited today to show you some brand new animations and graphics that will give you more insight as to what this Delta used to look like than anything you've ever seen before. So we're very excited to do that. The one thing that you want to ask is why should you care about what we're doing in terms of ecosystem restoration? As Paul clearly stated our water supply in Southern California, a very important water supply, by the way, in terms of the 30% that it represents overall. That 30% that comes from the Delta is very low salinity water compared to the Colorado River water. So you can only recycle water so many times before you accumulate so much salt. So you have to constantly bring in a low salinity source in order to extend your recycling. So this is a very, very important 30% of your water supply. So the reason we want to understand the ecology is that as you want to maintain your water supply reliability, you understand that water supply and ecosystem are heavily linked. And so the health of the estuary really drives the dependability, reliability of your water supply. So what I'm going to do now is begin the story. Robin's going to come on and give you a lot more detail, and then I'll end. So we're going to pass back and forth once here as we go forward. So the first thing I want to do is, again, reiterate the importance of the Delta. Bay Area, a lot of people don't realize, gets almost 3/4, 70% of their water from the Bay Delta watershed, 33% of their water directly from the Delta. Central Valley up to 90%, and as I said, there's a very important 30% in Southern California. We have an ecosystem in the Delta. It's certainly not the ecosystem that we had 200 years ago, 150 years ago, and we're going to talk a lot more about that. So the first thing I'm going to do is fly in to the Delta. Some of the key features in the Delta, where the salt field is, and we had salt intrude well into the Delta this year. Amazing amount of salinity intrusion that occurred in January timeframe. Flying into the Delta, we have an inverse Delta. It's fairly unique in the Delta. If you think of a Delta like the Mekong or Mississippi or Amazon River Delta, these deltas all fan out to the ocean. What I was going to show you is how our delta is an inverse delta in that the two rivers come together before they go out to the ocean. I was going to fly you over the islands in the delta. These islands, we call islands. You think of an island as something that sticks up. You've been to Hawaii or the Catalina Islands. You're looking down at the water. When you're delta, as you probably know, you're on an island, you're looking up at the water. So our islands are really holes. There's some 80 major islands, 433 islands when you count all of the little ones in the delta. And then the channels that make up the delta today, there are about 700 miles of waterways that make up the delta. The historic delta, as Robin will show you, hopefully, a little bit later, is that the delta historically had over 5,000 miles of channels. So you compare the 700 to 5,000. And these channels that used to be very meandering, what we call dendritic, sinusoidal channels, have been straightened. So now, if you want to go from A to B in the delta, it's a much shorter distance than you would have had to travel historically going through the delta. So I'm going to see if I can advance the slide, or if I even have control. I don't. Okay. This worked yesterday. So with this slide up here, if it stays there, one of the points I like to make is that this is the delta, Bay Delta system that used to exist that our native fish evolved in. So the delta smelt, the salmon, the fish that we really are trying to protect under the Endangered Species Act, they evolved in a system in which all of this purple area was their home. But today, as you can tell on this panel on the right, some 98% of that habitat has been lost. And so we're trying to restore ecosystems with a highly, highly degraded estuary in terms of habitat. So one of the things that we're trying to do is, as indicated, is get this 8,000 acres going to 30,000, going to 60,000 acres of new tidal marsh. Oh. Okay, so these are some quick snapshots showing what you're going to see in more detail in terms of, and unfortunately you didn't get to see the video, which was showing you kind of the before, but this is kind of what the delta looked like before, and I'm going to show you some after pictures. one of the things you'll see here is a lot of curved channels. If you look at a map of the Delta today, they're only straight, mostly straight, slightly bending channels. So the fish that we're concerned about today are these and when they were listed. These are, so I'm going to quickly run through some pictures of the Delta today. This happens to be Mildred Island looking north. This is the San Joaquin River out here. One of the things I like to say about the Delta today, our Delta is not really channels, but more like rock line canals. If you think of a water conveyance system, you usually have a trapezoidal channel, steep banks. That's really what our Delta levee system is like today. It's more like how to convey water, not really concerned about what the ecosystem is looking like. You get to begin to see a little bit about subsidence here. So again, the map on the right is the current Delta, and you'll see in more detail as Robin goes through his presentation, the differences between the channel configurations. So today, relatively straight channels. You can see the channel historically was very sinusoidal. So I'm going to turn it over to Robin, and then he'll come back, hopefully, and have an animation that will work at the end.
So I'm going to tell what's sort of a mystery story, as Kurt has set up. It's not really an action story, I have to admit. It took about 5 years of research, but it is a mystery, and I'll try to compress that into about 15 minutes or so here. And that mystery is, what was the Delta like? How did it work? As Kurt has started to give you a sense of, the Delta was really the centerpiece, arguably, of the state's ecosystem. It's this freshwater wetland in the center. You can see that red circle. In the center of the state, it was 700,000 acres of freshwater wetland. It was a coastal, much of that was tidal. That means it was influenced by the ocean. So it represented that portion, this small little portion of the state was over about half of the state's coastal wetlands, the entire state's wetlands in this one little spot, almost half of the coastal wetlands. And they were perennial, year-round freshwater wetlands, right? So they were wet and lush and productive year-round in a state that dries out naturally every summer, right? A 6-month drought every year. So it's really an oasis in the middle of the entire state. So it's a remarkable kind of centerpiece of the system. It's like our Everglades. The most important, the biggest salmon runs went through the Delta. It was a key stop on the Pacific Flyway for waterfowl. It supported diverse animals and mammals like the Tule elk, river otters, beavers, riparian brush rabbits. It goes on and on. And it even was so big and unique that it supported the core populations of species found only in this part of California, like the Delta smelt, or like the California hibiscus, this beautiful flower. And yet we have this conundrum, this mystery. We know it was productive and rich and important, but we don't actually know how it worked. It's a mystery. Nobody has seen the Delta ecosystem in a functioning, healthy state for over 150 years. So no one alive today has seen that, and yet we have this challenging assignment, as Paul Helliker, Congressman Garamendi, and Kurt have all pointed out. We need to make it function better ecologically, but we have no clues. We diked it and drained it. Well, we do have clues, but we don't have that picture. So we diked it, we drained it, we filled it very quickly. Most of that was gone by 1870, 1880. And nobody took notes, or nobody studied it, but actually they did leave clues. And so we can piece those clues together, and I'll walk you through that a little bit. So I run the Center for Resilient Landscapes at the San Francisco Estuary Institute, and we help guide restoration strategies, help agencies and NGOs figure out what's possible, what might make sense to actually make the environment better. And one of the key tools is called historical ecology, which is literally the combination of history and science. And so we dig through the archives and we come up with historical maps, photographs, written accounts. These are the clues, little glimpses of the landscape and the ecosystem and how it worked. And then we weave all that together into a picture. To answer this mystery, which really is central to the future of California, as you've seen. These are studies we've done in other parts of the state, and I did want to mention a number of studies we've done with partners down in Southern California that might be of interest. And there's a fun website we made called caltsheets.org, where you can actually overlay historical coastal maps over the contemporary shoreline. It's pretty fascinating. So I want to walk you through our process, a little bit of the highlights of this journey of discovery over the past few years. And believe it or not, it starts with this map, which was one of the most interesting and believe it or not, important maps that we found, even though it looks a little sketchy. It is a sketch. It's a Spanish sketch made around 1840 that shows the delta. This is Rio del Sacramento. That's the Sacramento River. Rio de San Joaquin, the San Joaquin. So this whole area is the delta. And the thing that caught our interest was down here at the bottom. It says tulares y sauces. Tulare we understood. That means tules, big, tall marsh plants you'd expect there. But the sauce, that means willow. That was a surprise. We didn't expect that. We didn't expect any trees. It's too wet down there. But so we thought, well, maybe that's not the most accurate map in the history of the universe. On the other hand, it's pretty specific, and it says that several times. And we found another map about 10 years later. A lot has happened, right? Gold rush has started. The Mexican-American War happened, so it's American now. And a guy named Gibbs is making a map of the route to the gold mines, right? So these numbers are depths along the Sacramento River if you're taking a boat up the river. So that was quite useful. We used that information. But then we were intrigued by these little blobs around the edge of the river. That. And we know this symbol, these little hatches, means marsh, marsh vegetation. But this might be trees. Maybe that's the willows. Maybe those are clumps of willows. Still, not really enough to go on. Then we found the key, perhaps the holy grail for this little topic, the decoder ring. And it was an obscure document found in the archives, written in the 20th century, but interviewing a boy who grew up in Stockton, asking him to relate to me what the vegetation of the Delta was like during his boyhood, before reclamation began. And he said, one statement stands out above all others. There were extensive willow swamps with a dense understory of lady fern. Ferns. That was, again, not something we had expected. And he goes through and he details the different species, the fern, the black willow. This is where the hibiscus was. And so you can see how we're starting to piece together a picture. The fern, is interesting ecologically, also tells us a lot climatologically, right? Because that's a cool, moist environment in the central delta. It tells us a little bit how it was working. It's actually really interesting when you think about climate change. It was that kind of cool, probably fog-driven environment in the central delta. It's actually really important for delta smelt to keep the temperatures down. So you can see how these clues about ecology help us understand the whole system. Put that together with the map, and this other map, it starts to come together. And imagine that times hundreds and hundreds of documents, and we start building a web of information. Like this, a federal survey in the 1850s. So to set up the township and range lines that allowed the Homestead Act grants to be made, surveyors had to follow lines through the landscape and record all the trees at each corner of the mile sections, right? So these are their notes, and we have tools that we turn them into information like this. So this is following the survey line, and we can reconstruct from the trees and features they crossed what that looked like. And you can see the marsh and then trees along the river. But that was just one line through a particular spot. And we get quotes then talking about along the river a narrow ridge of land covered with oaks, cottonwoods, willows, sycamores, a slightly elevated ridge. We're starting to understand, okay, so there are these features along the river, a little higher ground. They have trees. This is the kind of vegetation. Another one of my favorites was this letter to my father from a homesick young man going up to the gold mines, describing everything to his dad. And one of the big surprises for us were these giant lakes he drew. He had horrible spelling, but he was very descriptive. And the map is not very precise, but it has a lot of information. And we found other information about the lakes, but we didn't know, nobody knew there were lakes in the delta. They might have been really important for waterfowl, for those fish we're so concerned about. How deep were they? Did they have vegetation? Well, then we found this really quite humorous document about this guy's misadventures being lost in the delta, a hunter, lost in the Tule marshes. And one of his stories was about how they unloaded most of their ammunition in the evening shooting all these ducks on a pond. And then went back the next morning to collect the ducks and found that they were lily pads. And so they had spent much of their out here in the marsh on lily pads, and they thought those were ducks. So that was actually really interesting for us, not just because that's the yellow pond lily, which is a really nutritious plant for waterfowl, but also they only grow in a certain depth. That tells it that the ponds are less than 6 feet deep. It tells it they're year-round, because the pond lily needs water year-round. More and more information. Then this was a really interesting piece, another clue. They talked about the water, so they ended up having to drink the water in the marsh because they got stuck out there and lost. And they described all the little animalcules in the water, that there were all these microorganisms because of the water coming out of the marshes. And this is a central question in the delta, as was mentioned earlier, is where did the productivity come from? Was it driven by the marshes? And this is a clue about that. We traced ghost channels off of early aerial photographs where you can still see the signatures. Imagine that times many, many, many documents put together with our best scientific knowledge about how these systems work, and we make a map of the different features that were there in the historical delta. This is a map of 1850 or so. And then, just in the last few weeks, literally, working with Kurt and his team, we've actually turned this into a view of what the delta looked like. So you will be the first audience ever. In fact, I only saw some of these things yesterday for the first time, hence some of the technical difficulties. I apologize. So we actually now can look back at what the delta looked like 150 years ago. Oh, right, there's some other maps that we used. Let's see if it works. All right, so flying in, this is the delta 150 years ago, coming in through the San Joaquin River, and you can see the very sinuous channels. If you look close, you can see some of the tiny channels that made those thousands of miles of fish habitat. Here's the willow fern swamps, these green patches. These are little sand dunes. These were Pleistocene sand dunes that gradually got drowned by the sea. Now we're coming down towards the center of the delta. These are the vast Tule marshes. The different color patterns are different ages of vegetation, older and younger. We're cruising down here to sort of the mouth of the delta, Sherman Island. Now the next one, if it works, heads up the Sacramento River. So this is just the first cut of this illustration. We don't have you can't zoom in yet to see the ferns and the hibiscus, but you actually will be able to do that because all that information is in there. So now we're heading up the river, because this is a sinuous Sacramento River. Now we're starting to see those trees where the riverine influence is more as you head up north. You start to get the levees along the river, and the river is splitting into numbers. So it's coming down from the north and splitting and making these forests, the great riparian forests of the delta. So with that tool, we can start to do some really fun, interesting, and informative things like this. Compare 1850 to today. I'll do it a couple times so you can compare the patterns. Is this going to drive people crazy, or is it interesting? So I find this shape in the middle, and you can see the shapes are remarkably similar. So we've sort of inhabited this template. See that shape still there? This marsh over here was diked off for, I'm not sure, 75, 100 years. Oops. Oh, no. This marsh over here, the levees failed, and marsh rebuilt itself, even with little tidal channels. So you can see the resilience of the system under the right situations. This big, long marsh in the middle of the channel, that looks almost exactly the same as it did 150 years ago. Sacramento River Channel is this massive, wide channel on the upper screen. It was a much narrower, sinuous channel. You can see this curve in the middle is now cut off. And in the bottom, I'll just point out, the Antioch Dunes are now industrial Antioch. So we start to get a more detailed, more rich understanding of the landscape and how it has changed, what the potential is for different spots. Here's my second example and only other comparison. This is continuing further up the Sacramento River, right towards Sacramento. This would be where Walnut Grove is today. Sacramento is further up towards the north. Now we're getting the levees, as we get further up the river, the natural levees alongside the river get bigger and bigger. So you know how that works. When the big river like the Sacramento floods, it deposits sediment immediately alongside the banks. And that area is higher ground, better drained, and can support forests. So these are vast forests, as much as a mile wide. And then we had these lakes. So let's see what that looks like today. Again, you see a lot of the same patterns. It's just used differently. Look at the lake right here in the center. You can see how the ownership patterns are actually shaped around that feature. This big lake up here is called Big Lake. It's actually still there as a depression in the land. And these natural levees, which supported trees, they now, you'll see, are where all the houses are, of course, in the towns, and most of the orchards, right? They supported trees, and they still support trees. Congressman Garamendi's pear orchard, I suspect, is on the natural levee along here. You can see a portion of this lake remains. So one of our big discoveries is that once you get out of the central delta where all the subsidence has happened, the topography and the shapes of the land are actually still largely intact. So there is potential for them to be reoccupied by natural processes depending on how we want to do that. So I'll show you one last interesting example. We can combine these images, sort of a mashup of the past and present, making the point that really the past isn't as far away as we might think. 150 years is actually not that long in terms of physical processes and how a landscape works. And we have the great challenge now that we start to have this information, how do we make an integrated landscape that supports agriculture, supports water infrastructure, and also has functional elements of an ecosystem? We're not going to do it this simplistically, but we're going to need to find spots and carve out areas that actually fit into the landscape and make a functional ecosystem at the same time that it supports the other needs. So just a taste of the research. I gave you mostly sort of the visual story, but we're also doing all this analysis to actually try to figure out what the size and scale and pattern of that needs to look like in the future landscape of the Delta with the marshes and the riparian forests and the aquatic elements. Just a taste of that. We have our historical ecology study reports available online. A bunch of copies are going to be printed soon. If you're interested, email me. And our report on sort of starting to look towards the future, what's possible, how that would work, that'll be coming out first report in the next few months. So feel free to check our website for that. And now I'll turn it back to Kurt to wrap it up.
Thanks, Rob. So we're quickly flying into the next animation here. You missed the beginning part probably, but we're going to see some of the same stuff that Robin just showed you. But this time I'm going to do something that Robin didn't do, and that was we're actually going to try to show you what's going on down at the microscopic level. So we're going to kind of do like a NOVA program here. We're going to fly into the Delta. We're going to go down and look at the microbes, and then we're going to zoom way back out. To give you an idea why this is important, Robin indicated that, and I just want to reemphasize the fact that the reason we're doing this is if we understand how the system worked 200 years ago, as we zoom in here to a tidal marsh, we're going to take a closer look, even zoom in, and we're going to go underwater here in a second. This is what tules look like, a dense stand of tules at high tide, and we're looking at this rich soup of zooplankton, phytoplankton that are, and then as the tide drops, what you see is all of this water then comes out of these tule marshes and drains back into the channels. This rich soup of highly rich organic material then comes back out, and as the tides continue to rise, as you can see here on Sherman Island, flooding tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of acres of this tidal marsh habitat, so that microbial activity is going on over vast areas. The tide drops, that water comes back into the channels, and then we're going to go back out of the delta and see the magnitude of which this was happening 200 years ago. So here we're flying into the central delta, what's currently Twitchell and Sherman, Bradford. This is Old River, currently Middle River, the San Joaquin River. And we're going to pull back out and take one last look at the magnitude, just this entire area that was very, very productive. And as just maybe to reiterate some of the things that Robin has already talked about, some of the early observations would be that we need to, that the habitat in this site, was just rich with ducks. There were harvesting back then in the late 1800s, some 12 million pounds of salmon, very large salmon coming out of the system. So I think with that, I'm going to wrap it up and I guess see if we have time for questions. Thanks.
Absolutely fascinating stuff. Huge body of research. That must have taken a long time to do. But very, very impressive and very important stuff. I have been informed we're running a little bit late on time, so unfortunately we won't have time for questions. But very thorough presentations and very informative. So I really, really appreciate that for myself. And so thank you. Another round for Robin and Kurt. Mark Twain once said, "Whiskey is for drinking, water is for fighting." One of my favorite quotes. For decades, those words have been true, especially in the dry and arid West. As water resources become more limited, California's economy is impacted, and so are its people, you and me. We are going to show a short video clip of the movie The Fight for Water, set at the outstart of the California water crisis in 2009. The Fight for Water highlights the human impact and environmental decision had on a farming community when their water supply was cut off and the walk they staged in order to fight for their water. Filmmaker Juan Carlos Osiguera set out to film this event and document their struggle as a cautionary tale on California's ongoing water wars. I'll show that clip now.
Number one commodity that we need is water.
The water system here were built 40, 50 years ago. Central Valley Project, State Water Project, they were built in the 50s and 60s. And that was when the state of California had, 10, 12 million people. And we're up over 30 million people now, and probably still growing. And so, we really think that the state needs to get prepared, not for just now for the crisis that is upon us, but for the next 40 or 50 years, because the state's going to continue to grow. And we may have global warming, as they say, and if we do, and if we have, lower rainfall and precipitation, we need to be able to capture and utilize and transport this water in a better sense that the state can survive. Otherwise, we're going to have these crises all the time. Every time we have a couple of dry years, we're going to be back in the same boat. I kind of like to think of this as your house. If you have the plumbing broken or plugged in your house and you can't get water, you can't take a shower, you can't go to the restroom, it doesn't matter what your economic situation is, you're going to get it fixed. Doesn't matter what you have to do, you're going to get it fixed some way or another. You're not going to wait for better times. And that in a kind of a humorous way is our situation in the state right now, but we're not out of the woods yet. Right now, we still have the environmental restrictions on our water imposed by the federal government, and we cannot survive another year unless they do something about that.
Our federal government needs to get involved in helping us with these pump restrictions. They need to get involved.